All right, what is up? Oh, wait, let me bring this down a bit. Yeah, the screaming in your ears. Oh my God. Okay, what is up, everyone? Today I'm gonna switch pace a little bit and look at text that I was only introduced to about a week ago, called "Governing by Debt" by Maurizio Lazzarato. So this is the kind of text that I wouldn't normally look at or kind of present in this medium, because it's kind of it's fact heavy. It deals with contemporary political events in such a way that makes it difficult to extract from it kind of like philosophical ideas, and it really belongs to the realm of like social science in that way, which isn't bad, like, obviously. So for that reason, I tend to avoid these kinds of books, because the only real way most of the time to get something out of them is to kind of memorize the figures that are presented, or if you're writing an essay or something, to have the figures provided immediately through a text like this is pretty cool. But here, normally I would avoid it. However, this text is very interesting because it explores the implications of Deleuzian and Guattarian notions of capture and how that plays into control through taxation and through debt. Moreover, they go over a number of other key philosophical thinkers, which is it's really interesting how they do it. So on that note, here, let's jump right into it. So the first chapter is titled Profit, Rent, Taxes, 3 apparatuses of capture. Now, this idea of apparatuses of capture comes directly from Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus, which I actually did a talk on here with someone who's doing their research on that, not that chapter specifically, but Deleuze and all that kind of stuff, where we explore that chapter and what exactly an apparatus of capture is. And to kind of summarize really briefly, it has to do with the process, or I guess the processes by which states acquire different aspects, areas of social life, physical land, or anything like that, through legislation, through various other, at times even ritualistic means, to acquire certain things. So in that way, it's kind of, I guess, the title is self-explanatory in that way. It's an apparatus of capturing things. In Deleuze and Guattari, in the chapter, they really lay this out as having occurred, or suggest that this is a phenomenon that has occurred for a great deal of time. And they go back many thousands of years in many cases. But what Lazzarato is doing here is taking the idea and applying it specifically to the concept of debt, hence the title, Governing by Debt, and how debt is mobilized by the state, more specifically the capitalist enterprise of the state, using that as a means of control over people, over bodies, kind of placing them under the jurisdiction of a debt machine. So specifically, as Lazzarato writes, in capitalism, appropriation functions through a 3-headed apparatus of capture, profit, rent, and taxation. Now, these 3 institutions operate for the benefit of capitalism it pretty simply, for those people that are at least somewhat familiar with Marxist doctrine. This isn't a very radical or strange idea, and it makes a lot of sense in how these 3 things work together, that is profit, rent, and taxation, especially where, if we were to think about each of these 3 terms in a different way, profit dealing directly with the process of production, and the those that own the means of production, rent, those that own the means of production that, I guess, give out a bit of their land, not so that it can actually be owned by someone else, but so that it can be I guess, they can capitalize, they can profit off of someone else, I guess, existing under the illusion of them owning that land. We can think of banks in this way as well, where very few people actually own their homes, for instance. Rather, they have mortgages, which ultimately comes down to the banks owning their homes, where if they can't pay the mortgage, then guess what? You're out of there. And then finally, taxation, which pretty much subsumes everyone else that doesn't fall into the first two criteria, gets all of them under the same functional, or not so functional, but operating capitalist system. Now, for my own part, I tend to resist these types of analyses, at least how it's presented so far. Of course, it gets more complicated because it locates in capitalism, or it suggests that these elements are new with capitalism, which I don't even think is what Deleuze and Guattari say. Like, these apparatuses of capture have existed for a long time. So I find it at times reductive to simply associate current ills dealing with economic stuff, political stuff, social stuff with capitalism, precisely because these things existed in some cases. They preceded capital. However, that does not stop Lazzarato from asking some very interesting questions, specifically when he evokes Deleuze and Guattari and 1,000 Plateaus, to which he writes, "An analysis of the complementarity of the crisis has made manifest can be found in 1,000 Plateaus," and he continues, "If money," quoting Deleuze and Guattari, "if money is always distributed by an apparatus of power, its circulation and turnover, as well as the equivalents, goods, services, money, are assured through taxation, which makes money a general equivalent. Taxes are what create money, and taxes are what monetize the economy." So taxes, I guess, can be thought of as that thing that enters capital into the law of equivalence, where there is established a general standard for what money should give a general public, therefore reinforcing the idea of the need for money and reinforcing the idea for capital or capitalism. So in that way, again quoting Deleuze and Guattari, "The tax on aristocrats and the distribution of money to the poor were a means of bringing money back to the rich." It's kind of turning the idea of trickle-down economics back, putting it on its head, right? The kind of liberal idea that if we reduce regulation, anything like that. I say liberal idea, but it's become like a conservative idea. Like these terms are really wish-washy. But the traditional liberal idea that if you reduce regulation, leave the market to itself, what you will see are people prospering among all walks of life. Whereas Deleuze and Guattari make apparent here, and that which Lazzarato chimes into, if we tax the rich in order to give to the poor, all that does, and it does it through a plethora of ways, is really emphasize the need for capital. And it creates, that welfare state type situation where people are then dependent on capital and capitalism in order to survive. So as Lazzarato says in relation to this, taxation ensures the wholly political reproduction of an economy, which by itself would be incapable of functioning according to the fundamental political divisions that constitute it: creditors, debtors, capital, labor, etc. So all this is a fundamentally political act. There isn't that kind of split between economics and politics as we might think, and he goes into this in much greater detail in a little later on. But what we have is a wholly political situation where, as he says, its fundamentally political instrument, that is capitalism, is taxation. So when taxation is used to guarantee, or at least provide the illusion of there being these kinds of needs being satisfied through social services or anything like that, what it does for Lazzarato is actually, not only instill the illusion of there being this kind of homogeneous set of needs, but rather, or in addition to that, it reaffirms the need for taxation, reaffirms the need for that kind of mandate or that control over these services by some locus of power, be it government or whatever, mass, multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporations or whatever is in control at that particular moment. So Lazzarato is really thinking about this, and this book came out in 2013, coming after the 2008 financial crisis, where there really was a global crisis due to a single country for some part. That is, one country's inability to account for their housing bubble resulted in many other countries going under, going into depression, essentially, which really emphasizes the reach of this system on a global level, where it seems as though nothing exists outside of this system. So what we see is this kind of, the realization of a homogenization of this sort of power through taxation, or of this sort of control through taxation. Taxation, through its claim to be providing something for us, places us, according to Lazzarato, in the state of indebtedness, where we feel like we are made to be subordinate, or that we are placed under the servitude or made subordinate to a system that has given us so much. At least that's how it advertises itself. And this is very similar to the thesis that Baudrillard puts forth, if we might remember, in The Consumer Society. For those that aren't familiar, there's a video on it called The Vicious Cycle of Growth on YouTube by who's that by? By Corey Garden, that gives a really eloquent look at Baudrillard's chapter, where he essentially argues that despite all the kind of progressive efforts to make taxation really beneficial to people in whatever form we could think of, what we ultimately see is the growing divide between the rich and the poor, where despite the past 50 years of there being kind of not a revival, but but a hashing up of public consciousness in relation to economic oppression, what we see is not necessarily a benevolent move in the right direction, but rather the continuation of an oppressive system through the increase in the division between the ultra rich and the ultra poor. So for that reason, Baudrillard, like Lazzarato, are two people that they're very weary about any sort of rhetoric around the possibility of using something like taxation for good, or using something like government intervention for good, because they feel like government, they feel like capitalism, they feel like taxation are those things that are fundamentally flawed, and there can't be a kind of benevolent use of that. Now, with that being said, and it's kind of tricky to see where Lazzarato, or what Lazzarato is suggesting, because it would seem on one side, he's kind of like an anarchist, but on the other side, like at points, it seems as though, he's prepared to accept some kind of like, these liberal policies or whatever that would see people benefit directly from services, from social services, or from healthcare services, or whatever else. So for that way, we shouldn't just, for those people that might want to just disregard this type of thinking as being along the lines of some kind of pseudo-anarchist libertarianism, there is more here than just that. So kind of moving from Deleuze and Guattari, Lazzarato takes the time to think about Carl Schmitt. So Schmitt was a conservative German who was very interested in kind of the Machiavellian notions of taking political power, what that meant, how to do it. So in that way, he was a reactionary, right? And Lazzarato makes that incredibly clear. And he quotes Marx, where Marx says, it's almost as good to look at consider the words of the reactionaries as to consider the words of the reformists or the revolutionaries, because there's a lot of truth in what they say, even if it is kind of antithetical truth. So what Schmitt provides for Lazzarato is as follows. Schmitt helps us to avoid any kind of utilitarian, contractualist, or conventionalist conception of the economy. The economy always begins with barter, exchange, commodity capital, and the relationship between free contracting parties. The great merit of this reactionary thinker is to have reversed the order, replacing the market and exchange's starting point with a political one, which is interesting because it doesn't just take kind of the Marxist conception of anything political, right? And we think of our superstructure here, where everything derives from the means of production or from the way in which the economy is kind of organized. Everything else develops from that: philosophy, politics, society, anything like that. Whereas Lazzarato identifies in Schmitt a recognition of the political actually coming before, in part, these apparatuses of capture or these kinds of capitalist institutions that he's been describing. So, of course, Schmitt poses many problems. Schmitt was a thinker of the nation state, something that as Lazzarato identifies, something that he lamented. He liked the idea of the nation state, and he was very fascist in that way. But in contrast to the nation state, Lazzarato sees in Schmitt kind of contempt for the idea of the social state. So the social state is a new kind of state that has little to do with the nation state, whose loss of autonomy led to its gradual but inevitable disappearance, which Schmitt laments. Moreover, Schmitt also calls the social state the total state. In his writing, the term does not refer to an all-powerful totalitarian state. It represents a symptom of the weakness, failure, and decadence of these states' old ethical and political principles. So in the social state, at least how Schmitt recognized it as being influenced by, liberal kind of Marxist thought, he suggested that, what Lazzarato sees in Schmitt was that Schmitt accuses proponents of the social state of minimizing the problem of appropriation. Liberals, and especially ordo-liberals, failed to recognize the political nature of appropriation and distribution because they seemed to deny that one had to take from one group in order to give to another. So for him, it would just be because there was too much of an emphasis on this idea of the kind of the economy, which kind of excluded real people, kind of lacked that kind of epistemological evaluation that would consider variations in what people may have wanted or thought important. So in that way, there is a reduction of people under the kind of guise of scientific socialism that reduce them in some way. So for Schmitt, as Lazzarato identifies, this was just kind of an illusory form of democracy and peace, or at least the idea that would come out of this idea of state socialism, or rather state society. They then go on to present another key term out of Schmitt's vocabulary, notably conquest of the earth, where they say that Schmitt accounts for, in part, this kind of globalized effort indicative of kind of state society or social society or whatever term we could stick in here, that was kind of that was a result of us losing our connection to the traditional nation state. So very reactionary in that way. But there is certainly a point to be had about the tearing down of borders, or the tearing down of distinctions between people under the pretense of a capitalist economy that sees only profit. And this is really made apparent with the global economic crisis of 2008, where Lazzarato identifies that what we saw was really the destructive capabilities of capitalism. So what he says is that although capitalism is both a process of production and destruction, the crisis has led to the collapse of the former on the one hand and the liberation of the destructive side of capitalism on the other. It is not a question of balanced budgets, of reviving the economy, but of destroying the constant and variable capital that fails to comply with the norms of valorization of the financialized economy. So he takes this idea to think once again about Deleuze and Guattari, notably the notion of deterritorialization, which I don't fully agree with how he deals with it here, but it presented anyways, where he says that it is now a given that capitalist deterritorialization is not relative but absolute. Deterritorialization not only means the destruction of the labor force, the destruction of productive capacities, techniques, commodities, modes of consumption deemed obsolete in order to create others, which will in turn be destroyed in order to create still others. Deterritorialization also means the destruction of the earth, the planet, and the environment which make life possible. Now, in Deleuze and Guattari, that sentiment is certainly there, but at the same time, they also view deterritorialization as a potentially positive force, where they call for people to kind of embrace it, embrace the kind of rhizomatic possibility that comes out of deterritorialization, so that people are not stuck within the homogenizing tendencies of capitalism. So although I think this is correct, what Lazzarato says, he doesn't present the way in which deterritorialization is also something applauded by Deleuze and Guattari. So from here we'll move into the next chapter titled, and this would be very relevant to anyone listening I'm sure, titled The American University, a Model of the Debt Society. So he presents an article, or he says that a recent report from the New York Federal Reserve on U.S. household debt presented data on American student indebtedness. On March 31st, 2012, the total amount of students had borrowed and still owed in order to finance their university studies reached $904 billion, $30 billion more than just 3 months earlier. The number is equal to over half of the public debt of Italy and France. For much lower debt, the European Union and the IMF promptly tore Greece apart, a country now in its 6th year of recession. For comparable or lower sums, recession, austerity measures, personal sacrifice, unemployment, and poverty are imposed on the millions of citizens of indebted countries. So this indebtedness gives us the semblance of a sort of individuality, where on one side it sucks to be in debt, obviously, but at the same side it is kind of the extension of the old desire to be indebted to supernatural powers, as he says, where, quoting an anthropologist who says that we may ask if the whole of the enormous movement of the modern economy might not be the last and most radical way to eliminate the gods, to do away with gift-giving and debt. So in that way, how we can conceive of this as having some relationship to the idea of the debt of life, or the original debt. That is the one that needs to be returned with a counter gift or a gift or sacrifice or whatever, which he comes to challenge a bit, but I'm just throwing this term out here. So in that way, he quoting someone else who says that relieved of any kind of psychological or moral burden, exchange, at once rational, efficient, and free, develops very quickly. And then here we have Lazzarato once more. We learn to be free then, not only in economic and religious terms, but also in moral and psychological terms. With all of these freedoms, we have finally become complete individuals. So these students under debt, he's saying, and he's being kind of playful, I think, here, kind of ironic. This isn't something to be applauded, right? This idea of individuality, kind of thinking about Foucault as well, is not something to celebrate, but it gives us this semblance of a sort of freedom, the illusion of freedom. So despite what these other people that Lazzarato quotes are saying, he doesn't see this as really being something to celebrate, right? So for the anthropologist, the idea that we've emancipated ourselves from the gods, or that we are seeing are being relieved from a sort of anxiety-inducing system, these are all absurd ideas, precisely because we are thrown into a more controlled system. So although students or people can claim to be free, Lazzarato makes clear that students contract their debt debts by their own volition. They then quite literally become accountable for their lives, and to put it in the terms of contemporary capitalism, they become their own managers. Factory workers, like primary school students, are controlled within an enclosed space, the factory walls, for a limited time and by people who, and apparatuses which remain exterior to them and are easily recognizable. So it is how we've turned that kind of disciplinary gaze onto ourselves, which is really just a consequence of this. Like, this is how Foucault thought about it as well, how we come to mandate ourselves. So like Lazzarato says, we are our own managers. We are our own capitalist property owners. And all this makes it rather difficult to challenge, because on one side, you don't necessarily want to suggest that the only way out of this system is for people to give up this idea of their freedom and their autonomy, because this idea of indebtedness is wrapped up within that very idea. So it becomes difficult, because if you suggest that, people will quickly remove themselves. They will quickly lose interest in whatever you have to say because it doesn't seem worth it. But at the same time, there is a necessity to make this apparent, that it does demand some sort of sacrifice to emancipate oneself from this very oppressive system. Because as long as we are in debt, and he uses Nietzsche here, debt is always and already infinite debt in contemporary capitalism. What we are thinking about here, though, and Lazzarato makes this very clear by invoking Deleuze-Guattari and Nietzsche, is that this is not simply an extension, as I may have mucked up a little earlier on, like I want to clarify this. This sort of debt is not simply an extension of the original debt, or our indebtedness to a kind of unseen force or an unknown power that gave us this thing called life. No, what we are talking about here is very material. So what he says is that original debt does not link individuals to the community. It is not the sign of a primitive indebtedness transmitted at birth, of an inaugural debt that no one can ever repay. On the contrary, it is produced by a definite political situation whose genealogy and history can be traced. So in that way, it's material. It has its effects on the everyday life, and it is something that, as he says, has a history, and it is something that can be traced. So for that reason, it's not as obscure, or doesn't exist in the realm of the metaphysical. So for the three thinkers he presented earlier, that is the anthropologist and the economist and the philosopher, as I think I've made pretty clear, he says that Deleuze and Guattari make the opposite point. That is, they make a point against the idea that in modern capitalist societies we are able to free ourselves from debt through monetary reimbursement. That is, we're able to free ourselves from the kind of metaphysical debt with this material form. Lazzarato is much more interested in what Deleuze and Guattari have to say, which is that the opposite argument, which goes as follows: archaic societies are characterized by a finite and mobile debt, while the emergence of empires, states, and monotheistic religions, debt has become infinite debt. So in the kind of capitalist age, or even earlier, the idea of debt was not. It wasn't an infinite in that it wasn't a totalizing system. So there was the ability for any community to engage in this thing called debt in a very different way. Whereas today, what we see through this idea of infinite debt is the, I guess, grasp of the entire planet, where every community can be subsumed under this very category. And in the old system, what I just kind of reluctantly call the old system, or the pre-capitalist one, there are thinkers who thought that, or still think, that sacrifice was a way by which people emancipated themselves or lessened the burden of debt. So as he says, sacrifice constitutes the transcendence relative to which everyone is indebted. It resolves the problem of war of all against all by revealing, through the sacrificial victim, a mediation, a transcendence, whose descendants are money, the state, and sovereignty, that pacifies the original violence that exchangers, producers perpetuate on one another. So to kind of supplant his analysis, he takes aim at René Girard, who is a thinker of sacrifice and the way that sacrifice performed this function. So he quotes Girard here, who says that there is a unity that underlies not only all mythologies and rituals, but the whole of human culture, and this unity of unities depends on a single mechanism, continually functioning because perpetually misunderstood, the mechanism that assures the community's spontaneous and unanimous outburst of opposition to the surrogate victim. So in response to this, Lazzarato scoffs, and he says that unfortunately, sacrifice is not in the least universal. It is not found in all archaic societies, but only in those that settle the problem of power relations through transcendence. According to André Leroy-Gourand, sacrifice was unknown in Paleolithic societies, nor is there any trace of it in hunter-gatherer societies. So this point is important, and what he's doing here is really emphasizing the material aspects of his case, saying that he doesn't want to get bogged down in the metaphysical concerns of debt, indebtedness, sacrifice, the countergift, as long as they don't manifest themselves materially. He says that is all jargon, it's crap, and he just kind of brushes it away by saying that, look, it's not a universal concept as the primary thinker of sacrifice, René Girard, suggests, and for that reason, it's crap. Now, I have a problem with this. I think that there's something certainly important about what Lazzarato is doing, but he does undermine the role of symbolic institutions in the maintenance of social organization, or of a kind of general group connection or connectivity. So for Lazzarato, sacrifice or anything like that is not some kind of way to speak to the gods and really allow for people to organize together under the guise of being against some mythical or unknown force. Rather, according to Lazzarato, the institution of sacrifice does not proceed from human nature, from the original violence that supposedly defines all societies, as Girard would like us to think. It is instead the result of an appropriative political operation carried out by the state, the priest, and the bureaucrat, as well as the imminent practices of the shaman. So in that way, sacrifice marks a political victory over the forms of organization and other conceptions of the world and the cosmos. And then just as Girard projects his monotheistic fundamentalism onto societies that were not monotheistic, so heterodox economic theory projects through life debt its need for state institutional mediation onto societies organized in such a way as to avoid such mediation. So that just is Lazzarato essentially suggesting that in this discourse pertaining to sacrifice, what we see is not necessarily an observation of what just occurs, but rather what we are seeing through Girard, at least this is how he recognizes it, what we see is the imposition of an already established idea onto these pre-capitalist or these other societal formations. So for that reason, he proposes that it is the mirror of these same kind of economic systems that perform the same thing today. So Nietzsche is a figure that is much more interesting as opposed to this kind of discourse around sacrifice for Lazzarato, because Nietzsche's thinking about the Übermann or about values and the genealogy of morals presents for him kind of an autonomous subject, and I'll say that hesitantly, because it's a little bit more complicated. But what he says, invoking the work of Graeber. So Graeber, by making a claim that would make even an undergraduate think twice, namely that Adam Smith's Homo economicus and its corresponding rationality are the basis of Nietzsche's philosophy, blithely mistakes the question of value with that of the value of the market and of the political economy. Nietzschean man is indeed the creature that measures values, that evaluates the valuating animal as such. But these values do not depend on the market or on Homo economicus. It is neither the market nor Homo economicus that creates, measures, and evaluates values. Value presupposes evaluations, evaluating points of view from which their value stems. So for Nietzsche, it is much more important to criticize this idea of values, to not necessarily focus on, as Lazzarato quotes him, the value of this or that table of values, the value of existing evaluations or anything like that, but rather the Nietzschean mode would be to evaluate or to criticize, to analyze this thing called values themselves, rather than specific values of specific things, as the kind of liberal philosophical economist might have it. And it follows from here Nietzsche's speaking about the idea of infinite debt as being this new development in the course of things, right? So by thinking about this idea of values, or how the future of philosophical thinking would be concerned with the values of specific things as opposed to the question of values themselves that are surely a product of some kind of capitalist intervention, Nietzsche, in a sense, can be said to think about this capitalist system in terms of the apparatuses of capture through Deleuze and Guattari, and how Lazzarato is thinking about it in a way that might seem a little strange to think about Nietzsche in terms of anti-capitalist type thinking. But I think that there is certainly some weight to that in the way that capitalism has or tends to, create the idea of values in places where it doesn't exist. And Nietzsche, thinking about these Übermann or anything like that, getting to the bare roots of things in a sense, and how that opposes this kind of capitalistic production of value. So ultimately then, as Lazzarato states, it is not through an act of repayment, but through a political act, or refusal, that will break the relation of domination of debt. Contrary to an opinion everyone from anarchists to neoliberals seem to share, the debt of today's capitalism is unpayable, unreimbursable, and infinite. So our only opportunity then is to exit capitalism altogether. So from here, we'll move into the third chapter dealing with the topic of governmentality. So specifically, it is titled Critique of Governmentality 1. Does liberal governmentality exist? Has it ever existed? So he begins this chapter by stating that transformed into a crisis of sovereign debt, the financial crisis has imposed new forms of governmentality and new subjective models both on the side of those who govern, technocratic governments, and on the side of the governed, the indebted man who expiates his fault through taxes. These new subjective models reveal the true nature of the techniques of governmentality and of the relationship between liberalism and capital better and more profoundly than was the case during the rise of neoliberalism. So he takes this time now to think about Michel Foucault's contribution to this topic of subjectivity, specifically invoking Foucault's Security, Territory, and Population, where Lazzarato identifies that Foucault himself affirms that, quoting Foucault here, the problem of sovereignty is not eliminated. On the contrary, it is made more acute than ever. So then to relate this back to his own thesis, he states that as the crisis has unequivocally shown, liberals, far from providing an alternative to state government, are only one of the possible forms of subjectification of state capitalism. So the role of governmentality then is not to limit or not to reduce the amount of control exerted over people. Rather, governmentality does not govern as little as possible. Its aim is to construct the social state, an economic state underpinning the socialization of valorization whose target is society above all else. So here we're thinking again of Schmitt's contribution to that idea of the social state and the effect that has on the kind of establishment of universal needs or anything like that poses a threat to, people's possibilities or their possibility to engage in possibility. So all our kind of political organizations suffer because of this. Thinking about representative government or anything like that, they all fall under the same rubric of capitalist exploitation. So as Lazzarato makes clear, the representative political system and the rule of law have met the same fate, that is, kind of destructuration of their possibility pre-social state. Contrary to the claim Foucault seems to make that the participation of the governed in drawing up the law in a parliamentary system is the most effective system of governmental economy. The crisis has radically neutralized the voice of the governed, even in the case of elections. So this is not a totally radical idea. Like, it's something anyone might come up against, how voting doesn't do anything because it still, simply changes hands. The power changes hands, doesn't actually challenge the idea of power. And that is what essentially Lazzarato is trying to get across here, where it also comes down to the Luxembourgian, Rosa Luxemburg's doxa about reform or revolution. Which one of those is a more effective strategy for her? Clearly, revolution being the best option. The same for Lazzarato here as well, where reform would fall on the side of the kind of participatory government or representative government systems that he sees in Foucault, right? So in that way, he's advocating for a kind of new revolutionary politics that bypasses all of the already affected political institutions to get at the core of the issue. So as he says, rather brutally, on their own, liberals would never have ventured anything other than a democracy of property owners. So how they just participate in that very system. So in a rather provocative turn, he says that the state is a result of the economy. So specifically, he states that the state does not precede the economy, but results from it. Now, this is totally contrary to what Deleuze and Guattari have to say, because the state, they say, is something that has always been, right? That is a response to the kind of archaeological research that was being done at the time they were writing 1,000 Plateaus, or just before it, where for them the state has perhaps always existed in some capacity. But what he's saying here, at least what Lazzarato is saying here, is rather interesting, because it considers the possibility that no matter what efforts are conducted in the state, will always already be participating in that capitalist system. So it does sound repetitive, I'm sure. In reading it is a bit repetitive, but he's kind of approaching it from different ways and how to think about it. So then, once again, he takes aim at Foucault for not properly considering this. Now, to me, I don't think Foucault really needed to. Like, Foucault is the one that said, in the order of things, like, Marxism is in the 19th century is like, or the 20th century is like a fish in the water, like 19th century. It can't breathe anywhere else, right? Foucault has always been pretty critical of Marx and Marxism in general. So it seems odd that, Lazzarato is getting at Foucault for, I quote, who fails to problematize the most important institution of capitalism, that which expresses both in the most abstract and most concrete way capitalist relations of power. I wonder if Foucault really needed to, but no, we have it here. Like, it's Lazzarato's critique, and we're stuck with this. I guess Foucault could have been more critical of capital, but no, we have it here. But it is difficult if we really try to get at what Lazzarato is saying about taxation or about social services or anything like that. He does seem to flip-flop, kind of move back and forth, whereas right here he says that we still have citizenship, but we lose social services a little bit every day. It would seem as though he's advocating for some kind of government system that is able to maintain or to kind of mandate these social services, which would seem to contradict or conflict with what he says about the, I guess, inherently malevolent nature of these institutions. So it's tricky to kind of reconcile what exactly he is advocating for. So for those that have read this, like, really take me to task if I'm just being a poor reader or I'm being unfair. I just find it difficult to sift out a single thread dealing with the kind of pragmatics of his approach. So yeah, from here I'll kind of close out that third chapter where he really emphasizes the oppressive effects of this kind of capitalist manifestation of the state that just sees, profit for the sake of profit, people as being expendable for profit or anything like that. Tend off here before moving into the second half of the book. But this is an interesting one for anyone that has listened this far, you know, I definitely recommend someone going to check it out. It's tricky. It's not the easiest read, and it would certainly help if you have a background in Deleuze and Guattari, Schmitt, or Foucault, because he draws upon them extensively. But right, for anyone who made it this far, cool. Thank you. If you have problems with me, you know how to leave it. Anyways.